About a month ago, the Strauss Center hosted a workshop to discuss how historians, strategists, and policymakers might work more closely together to find ways to bridge the gaps that exist between disciplines and also that exist between the ivory tower and the world of policy. Sadly, this kind of communication and interaction is all too rare in our highly specialized stovepipe world. Yet there's one scholar who has consistently avoided being pigeonholed, whose work is of equal interest to political scientists and historians, who has resisted fads and encouraged the use of whatever methodology is best suited to the question being asked. And most importantly, the question should be an important one worth being asked. This scholar, who is our guest here today, has always understood that scholarship in national and international security should contribute to making better policy, better strategy, and better decisions. The career and accomplishments of Richard Betts are not just a personal model to me. They also mirror exactly what we, myself, Kate, Celeste, Will, and Jeremy, and others are trying to accomplish at the Strauss Center, and in particular in the History, Strategy, and Statecraft program. To produce smart, penetrating, deeply researched analysis that transcends disciplines and is accessible and of use to decision makers who need to make important decisions about uncertain futures and in extraordinary pressure. Richard Betts is the Arnold Saltzman Professor of War and Peace Studies in the Department of Political Science. He's also the Director of the Institute of War and Peace Studies and the Director of the International Security Policy Program at the School of International Public Affairs at Columbia University. He's also a Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Before that, Dick was a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, where he was a colleague with our colleague, Ken Clam, until 1990. He's a former staff member of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the National Security Council, and has been an occasional consultant to the National Intelligence Council and the Central Intelligence Agency. His writings have earned numerous prizes, including the Woodrow Wilson Award of the American Political Science Association for the best book in political science. He's written numerous books, some of which have had an extraordinary impact on the way I think about international politics. Today, we're very fortunate that he's going to be talking about his newly published book, American Force, Dangers, Dilemmas, and the Delusions in National Security. Please join me in welcoming Richard Betts to the Strauss Center and the University of Texas.
Well, thanks for those kind words, Frank. And I really appreciate the invitation to be here, since it's a long time since my last visit here, which I was mentioning a short time ago, was in 1977, doing research here in the library for one of my early projects, a book with Leslie Gelb on Vietnam policy. So it's nice to have the chance to be back, and to also to plug my new book, which is a general book. It's not focused tightly on one question. It's a collection of essays on an assortment of topics in national security policy. I'm not going to discuss all 12 chapters, but I'll capsulize the main points of several of them, and then leave to you to decide which issues you may want to follow up in the discussion. But I'll start with, I think, what passes for a unifying theme in the book. And I argue that American policymakers underestimated how radically the end of the Cold War reduced threats to national security, and overestimated the American ability to shape the world to our liking with efforts at acceptable cost. They conflated national security with international security, an identification that many or most of us in this business perhaps make, but that I would question. And I think they confused the difference between the defense of the United States and the control of world order. They should have recognized the Cold War victory as a chance to use American primacy to manage a transition to a global balance of power, rather than seeing victory as an opportunity to exploit primacy to control order everywhere. I think they overestimated capability, to shape world order at low cost. They wanted to do big things on the cheap, to use U.S. primacy to promote a liberal empire, but without paying much blood and treasure. I think these mistakes flowed from a loose consensus which united crusading liberals and neoconservatives, constituencies that would normally gag at being lumped together. But while they criticize each other for their preferred mode of action, their respective penchants for multilateralism or unilateralism, I think they agree more or less on the substance of what they want to get done. For most of the post-Cold War period, until the sobering results of two inconclusive wars, which showed that ambitious projects could not often be done on the cheap, opponents of this activist consensus were on the fringes of American politics. Pat Buchanan and Ron Paul on the right, Ralph Nader and Dennis Kucinich on the left, some cranky realist academics. Of course, I do recognize exceptions to my argument. I think the NATO action against Libya in the past year is an example of intervention that was restrained yet effective, so far at least. I want to see what Libya looks like a year or so from now, but that was done on the cheap because the United States could offload the job of heavy lifting to the Allies, and in this rare case could tilt the military balance on the ground with air power alone. So there are exceptions to my argument, but I do think there are exceptions. In general, though, the impulse to activism on behalf of world order was fueled by the spectacular but misleading cheap success of the first war against Iraq in 1991. That was a perfect use of force, a great success at comparatively low cost as wars go. Only about 200 battle deaths for Americans, almost no dollar expenditure. We passed the tin cup and got the Germans and Japanese and others to pay most of the bills. It was almost the first American war fought at a profit. Now, such a perfect war is unusual. The stars were aligned in a way that almost never happens. And we wound up undertaking other ambitious missions that wound up as messy, costly entanglements or Pyrrhic victories, or worse, only temporary successes when they were somehow concluded. Elites in both parties, especially under Clinton and the second Bush, I'm less critical of the first Bush and Obama, but elites in both parties wound up using force frequently but not intensely, when the reverse combination would have been better, to use force rarely but more decisively when it does prove necessary. Now, this general argument, of course, isn't original. It proceeds from a line by Clausewitz that's one of the epigraphs at the beginning of the book. He wrote, "A short jump is certainly easier than a long one, but no one wanting to get across a wide ditch would begin by jumping halfway." But the barriers to operating politically according to what sounds like common sense in that regard are huge. Politicians naturally want to get great leverage out of limited effort, and that often has led them to jumping halfway across the ditch. The argument for avoiding half measures, for either abstaining from force altogether or making a maximum effort, asks political leaders in a democracy to perform an unnatural act, to avoid the path of least resistance, which is compromise, to pay high costs at the outset of a crisis by choosing an extreme option rather than choosing the middle ground of limited action, which defers the costs of either extreme to a later date. Now let me briefly summarize some of the arguments about particular security issues made in some of the chapters of the book in case you want to get into more detail on some of them. I have a chapter, the third chapter, on confused interventions, or as I maybe a little snidely put it, puttering with primacy. And it's mainly about the Balkans and Somalia in the 1990s. Bill Clinton intervened with efforts deliberately meant to be both impartial and limited, qualifiers which vitiated each other and which led to prolonging conflict in Bosnia. It did enough to prevent either side in the conflict from winning militarily, but not enough to stop them from continuing to fight. So the United States and the United Nations supported slow bleeding rather than quick amputation. Finally, after Srebrenica, they acted decisively, but at what a price, if you recall what happened at Srebrenica. And then, before long, we got into a close-run conflict in Kosovo that wound up far bigger and more expensive than Clinton had bargained for. Also, it seems to me there has been a capricious selection of cases for the application of American force for humanitarian purposes. There have not been clear criteria for where or when the United States should use military power for humanitarian relief. Why the Balkans but not Sudan? There are no consistent criteria for some policy principles that rationalize the use of force. For example, about the question of secessionist movements. Should the United States support secession, as we did in Kosovo, or oppose it, as we always have in Cyprus, or fudge it, as on Taiwan, where we do our best to have it both ways? The fourth chapter is on weapons of mass destruction, where I argue that the importance of weapons of mass destruction is in some ways as great as during the Cold War, even though the way they present the problem is quite different. Since the Cold War, threats to the United States have declined in capability but risen in terms of intent. So-called rogue states will have only a handful of low-yield nuclear weapons or effectively deployable biological weapons, unable to pose the risk of complete annihilation that thousands of Soviet nuclear weapons did. But they, or terrorists who might get weapons of mass destruction, want to hurt us more than the Soviets did. So the threat in terms of capability is down, and in terms of intentions is up. For hostile states, deterrence or containment still apply as effective U.S. strategies, but they don't in regard to terrorists. You need a return address to threaten retaliation, and for that reason, as well as the willingness to commit suicide of some terrorists, which makes the threat of retaliation hardly significant, deterrence doesn't work very well against the enemies that have loomed larger in American policy in the last dozen years. For these and other reasons, I think there should be more emphasis on defense as compared to deterrence, and by defense, I mean civil defense or air defense, not ballistic missile defense, where most of the attention has been focused. Terrorist potential acquisition or access to weapons of mass destruction should be the main concern. Deterrence, I think, can work against nasty countries like Iran or North Korea, but not against Al-Qaeda. Fortunately, it's hard for Al-Qaeda to get or to deploy effective weapons of mass destruction, so the odds of the threat coming to pass are low, but they're not low enough. So I think this should be the highest priority of counterterrorism. And concerning which weapons of mass destruction are at issue, especially in regard to terrorist use, biological weapons should be a higher concern than has yet penetrated the public imagination, because of the combination that biological weapons have of potential lethality, which is equal to first-generation nuclear weapons, but they're much greater availability. Now, it's not easy to get effectively usable and potent biological weapons. It's just easier than getting nuclear weapons. I'm not going to discuss my chapter on terrorism, except to say that the threat has been exaggerated for understandable psychological reasons after September 11th. Which shocked most people because warnings from experts about the danger of catastrophic attack had not registered on most people. The exception to that exaggeration, again, I would say, is the risk that Al-Qaeda or its ilk could acquire and deploy usable weapons of mass destruction. I have a chapter on preventive war, where I argue that despite the rude experience of results from preventive war launched against Iraq in 2003, there is now, I think we hear much drum beating about doing it again against Iran, if not by the United States, by Israel, in which case the United States will get blamed for it anyway. Seems to me historical cases suggest that preventive war is almost always a bad idea. And here, too, it's crucial to keep the distinction between preemptive and preventive war, a distinction that was confused by the Bush administration and is confused by many journalists and common usage, where people sometimes use the term preemptive when they mean preventive. Preemptive war is, in many cases, much more legitimate or possibly sometimes sensible. Preemptive meaning when you ascertain that the enemy is about to attack and you simply beat him to the draw. People forget that decades ago, Stalin or Chairman Mao were considered every bit or even more wild and crazy than Kim Jong-il or Ahmadinejad. There were arguments for preventive war against the Soviet Union in the early 1950s or against China in the early 1960s. What if we had accepted those arguments and given in to them then? Think about how history would have been different, and it's hard to imagine that it could have been different in a good way. There's no reason to think that the odds of a peaceful outcome then were astronomically greater than they are in regard to Iran and North Korea. When one considers how, over time, enemies can become either indifferent or even friends as circumstances change, or the threat runs out of gas or is overthrown, and so on. And not to mention that a preventive attack against Iran would probably be ineffective in eliminating the nuclear capability it would be aimed at. And it would, it seems to me, radically inflame the intent of Iran to get, and even if it ever had any danger of recklessly using nuclear weapons, an attack would enhance that incentive. The dangers of the moment, though, it seems to me, are a little different. The danger that because of sanctions, Iran could precipitate war in the Strait of Hormuz, and if they start it and war happens, then attacks on the nuclear infrastructure have perhaps a more logical rationale. And there's also the danger of the United States simply getting dragged into war with Iran by Israel's preventive war that provokes catalytic Iranian retaliation against American assets. I have a chapter that I call Big Small Wars on Iraq, Afghanistan, and Vietnam. Not because I think Vietnam is a template for understanding recent wars. The differences are greater than the similarities, certainly. But there are limited similarities that are worth considering. And I couldn't resist doing so since a lot of my early career's research was on U.S. policy in Vietnam. I won't go over the long discussion of counterinsurgency theory and other questions about lessons I consider in that chapter here, but I'll note one general question that poses a dilemma for what the United States should be trying to do when it intervenes, and one apparent similarity between Afghanistan and Vietnam in the U.S. policymaking process that I find troubling, and which reflects the theme I mentioned at the outset. The first, the general question, is whether the United States should try to promote democracy in places like Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, or try to control internal political and administrative developments in order to reform, eliminate corruption, promote human rights, provide honest governments, and so on. In short, should we aim to democratize or to dominate local politics? Now, unless we credibly promote democracy, intervention loses legitimacy. But democratization takes away control and leaves the United States still stuck in the country, unable to prevent counterproductive behavior by the client regime, and still getting blamed for whatever goes wrong in the country. That's a dilemma to which I think there's no easy answer. And the second point, the similarity between Afghanistan and Vietnam. At critical junctures where the American decision to escalate military effort was made, civilian leaders chose the middle course, jumping halfway across Clausewitz's ditch, as it were. They did that rather than bite the bullet and and decide either to withdraw and accept defeat or to commit amounts of military power that professional military advisors believed were necessary to have a decent chance of winning. Policymakers didn't bite the bullet, they nibbled the bullet. They made major commitments, but a smaller one than military advisors thought necessary. This happened with Johnson, the namesake of your school, in mid-1965, and by the account of Bob Woodward, and that's all we have so far, with Obama in 2009. I have a chapter I call The Main Events, China's Rise and Russia's Resurgence. The bottom line of which is that US policy has worried too much about Russia and made relations with Russia worse than necessary, but has been too complacent about China. Russia poses no meaningful strategic threat, in my view. It's about half the size of the old Soviet Union. It faces a new and bigger NATO on its doorstep, a NATO that now includes not only former Soviet allies in the Warsaw Pact, but even parts of the old Soviet Union itself. Russia faces a demographic implosion, a fragile economic recovery, and it lacks any ideological mission which could justify concern about trying to resolve the titanic struggle for the future of the world militarily, as we used to worry about in the Cold War. China is the most important potential threat, but liberals fail to appreciate good reasons for worry, and hawks make the risks worse than they have to be. A new Cold War is not inevitable, but I think it's the default option if we don't have unusually skillful management of the relationship. In terms of academic international relations theory, I would refer to the argument by Robert Gilpin and a number of others that hegemonic transitions are rarely peaceful. I think the United States can control the strategic equation in East Asia, or it can have good relations with China, but it would be a historically unusual achievement if it can do both. And I think American policymakers, indeed American elites and public discussion in general, hasn't faced whether the United States should or would go to war to defend Taiwan or not. And leaving that decision ambiguous increases the risk of miscalculation in Beijing. I think there's a widespread tacit assumption that the status quo we have been accustomed to can endure forever. And I see no reason to assume that as China becomes more powerful and understandably assumes that it is entitled to the same prerogatives as any other great power, even the United States. Now, liberal theory sees all this as a non-problem or at risk of making itself a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the logic of economic profit means that Beijing and Washington have too big a stake in each other to wreck their own self-interest by war. What this view of the pacifying effect of mutual interest misses, however, is the question of what would make either side swerve first in a game of chicken over some catalytic event like a Taiwan crisis. So it's the old tragic view of the security dilemma in international relations, the danger that countries can wind up in a war despite their desire to avoid one. Taiwan aside, the biggest danger is not that China will be deliberately aggressive or will be another Wilhelminian Germany, the historical analogy that's most often trotted out. I think the biggest danger is that Taiwan will act like the United States. If Beijing takes on the mission of stabilizing disorders in its neighborhood, as the United States historically has in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, that will look like a dire threat. I have a chapter on civil-military relations in the United States, in which I argue that despite critics who now worry about a crisis in civil-military relations, it is not really a significant problem, and this is even for Democrats, of which I am one, despite the partisan identification of military professionals with the Republican Party. And I have a chapter with the title of Strategy and Illusion. which argues that strategy in all of this, of course, is necessary, but that doesn't mean that it's possible. There are a huge number of barriers to making military schemes produce planned outcomes. To mention just a few, half of all strategies, the losers, have to fail by definition. Winners often wind up with results far different from what they thought they were fighting for. The complexity of military operations makes close alignment of military instruments with political purposes hard to maintain. Psychological and cultural idiosyncrasies interfere with rational matching of ends and means and communications with adversaries. Goal displacement by professional organizations blocks translation of political leaders' objectives into outcomes that they envisioned. Wars take on a life of their own and throw up unanticipated requirements for success, deranging the original purposes. Democracy works against consistency in calculation and implementation of political aims, and so on. And the record of strategy in the United States, in my view, is not encouraging. It's not terrible, but not encouraging. Force is a blunt instrument. It's not practically usable for defined purposes in strategies that have a lot of moving parts and that are very refined. And these obstacles, it seems to me, are more reasons to reserve the use of force for necessary cases rather than elective ones. Finally, I have a chapter that's called Regaining Strategic Solvency. Fortuitously ironic that it's chapter 11 in the book. But I argue that since 1945, Americans came to take for granted the permanence of high peacetime mobilization. And after a brief partial demobilization after the Cold War, September 11th led to unprecedented, a decade-long expansion of defense spending with real increases in almost every year of that period. And even in the Cold War, increases never occurred for more than a few years in a row. The constituencies for economy and defense in both political parties, which had been significant even in the most dire years of the Cold War. The first half of the Cold War, Republican fiscal conservatives trying to restrain Democrats who wanted to spend more on defense. In the second half of the Cold War, Democratic doves doing the reverse. These constituencies for restraint evaporated. Democrats got burned too often for appearing feckless and wimpy on national security and gave up challenging the primacy of military concerns in the 1990s. And Republicans kept talking about fiscal responsibility, but presided over the biggest prolonged deficits where taxes were cut without commensurate expenditure cuts. And so Democratic politicians have to get over concern with the wimp image, in my view, and Republicans have to start to honor fiscal responsibility in practice rather than just in rhetoric. I think in the years since the book went to press, this has started to happen. Well, I'll conclude by returning to the rough unifying theme. My recommendation for bumper sticker level redefinition of American strategy would be soft primacy and burden shifting. I think one should distinguish primacy from activism. I think it would be good for the United States to keep primacy, but to enjoy its benefits as a cushion, not to make it a driver of policy. To keep American military superiority in the bank reserved for use on truly rainy days. For most threats, the United States should rely on containment and deterrence, and not preventive war. This is not a foolproof solution. It doesn't give me confidence. It's just better than precipitating exactly what it's meant to prevent. I think, unfortunately, we face a number of cases in international politics in which there simply are no good solutions, and the challenge is to find the bad solution that's not as bad as the others. When it's necessary to use force, the United States should not hold back and should use enough to overwhelm and control the outcome decisively. I guess this sounds much like the so-called Powell Doctrine. Now, in some cases, a light dose of force may work, as in Libya recently, but those are cases where the United States can tilt the balance to defeat an adversary, where limited war doesn't produce stalemate. For world order, if that's an important mission for the United States to promote, we should make all rich, civilized, decent countries step up to the bar and share the cost of setting the world right. If it's not worth it to them, it shouldn't be worth it to us. After all, we're the ones with the huge ocean moats to east and west and the weak neighbors to the north and south, blessed by God with the most inherent natural security of any great power in history. So my recommendations would be in that vein, but I think they pretty much contradicted American policy in the 1990s and the decade after September 11th. But recent events have pushed Washington in that direction, given the sobering effect of bloody noses in Iraq and Afghanistan and economic pressures that make cutting defense spending imperative. So force has to be used sometimes, but given the barriers to cheap success, it should be in cases where the balance of costs and benefits isn't close, but lopsided toward the benefits.
Thank you very much. A lot, very provocative, a lot to think about. Open up to questions. We have a tradition here of the first question always being a student. So let's start there, and you can manage the question.
In the beginning of your talk, you talked about how U.S. interventions never followed any set rules. We don't really have a way of deciding when we're going to intervene or not. I'm just wondering, what would be the advantages of having those kind of rules in contrast with the restrictions that are put on the United States?
Well, of course, one can always take refuge in Emerson's line that foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds, although a lot of people forget that said foolish consistency. But I do make the point in the book that I don't try to put out hard and fast grand formulas that should be followed. I think real life is too complex and there are lots of exceptions to what I said. I think in principle an unobjectionable norm should be, and I think it may implicitly have been in the minds of policymakers who actually miscalculated, but a basic norm should be intervention should be reserved for cases in which the benefits are high and the costs are low. The problem, of course, is it's hard to know beforehand. But benefits can be defined in different ways. They can be defined in hard material American national interests, or they can include humanitarian interests. For example, while I was skeptical of some of the interventions that were undertaken for humanitarian purposes, there were cases where it should have been done and wasn't. Rwanda, the most obvious, in 1994, where I think a lot of lives could have been saved with efforts that weren't too costly. And I don't know if Alan Cooperman's here. We can argue about what the numbers are that are relevant. It seems to me even a small fraction of the total that wound up being killed would have been a significant benefit. Otherwise, I would say there are a few cases in which the United States should get entangled forcibly in local politics. The Cold War, where I was, compared to now, I guess more of a hawk, it seems to me you could make a case, even though it was much debated then, about whether intervention was necessary in order to maintain the balance of power and keep Marxism-Leninism from winning the hearts and minds of everyone in the world and taking over the social and political organization of the globe. But if that rationale had any validity then, it doesn't now, because there is no transnational major competitive ideology to challenge the security of the West. You know, the closest we come is radical Islamism, and for a number of reasons, I don't think that's really analogous in terms of potential threat. So that would be the closest I would come to articulating a norm and a predisposition against the use of force, except in exceptional cases. But again, I think politicians, as much as I have the luxury of an academic of criticizing them, have good reason for wanting to maintain some flexibility and avoid hard and fast formulas. But on certain things, I think it would at least help on the inside of government to try to achieve some more clarity, and that is on things like supporting secession. Under what circumstances is it that we should and shouldn't? Maybe we should have different policies on it in different cases, but it seems to me there hasn't been any conscious reason for these differences. There have been sort of ad hoc reactions that have simply taken on a life of their own. Why we support the secession of Kosovo but won't recognize the Turkish Republic on Cyprus, not that they're completely analogous, but I think the issues are similar enough. It raises a question about what the logic behind our actions is. So I'd like to see a little more attention to some questions like that on the inside, even if we don't want to declare them all in public. Yes?
Me?
Yes.
Okay, I think that we have gone to war on fear. Remember the domino effect? That was fear. 9/11, that was fear. So we go to war. So my question is, I do have a question. If we've heard some talk about saber-rattling in that Israel might take a step toward Iran. So is the United States in that case, do you think the United States is going to come running to the support of Israel when they have atomic weaponry anyway? Are we going to run and help them or what?
On the first point, fear is usually the reason that is at least used as a justification for war, and in some cases it's quite proper to be fearful. I think in the post-Cold War period, though, it's less often justifiable to be that fearful because of the unprecedented security situation that existed. Now, on getting dragged into war by Israel, I think it's a real potential danger. One can't predict what will happen if Israel attacks Iran. Maybe when the dust settles, the Iranians will just grit their teeth and mount some terrorist retaliations against Israeli targets, not attack the United States. Maybe things would settle down. Maybe the outcome would be manageable, but I think there's no reason to assume that. There's no reason to assume that the Iranians would not retaliate against American assets in the region or elsewhere. And if they did, and killed many Americans, it would be difficult for the United States to forget about it and not become involved. So I think there's a substantial danger of a catalytic war. And that's why personally I would be a lot more forceful than we have been able to see in public, at least, in trying to restrain the Israelis. So there are reasons that doesn't happen, but the problem is that unless we prevent it in the first place, I don't think we have much control over whether we wind up at war with Iran. It will be in the hands of the Iranians, and when you leave the decision that way, you just can't bet a lot.
Dr. Betts, you grouped together Vietnam and Afghanistan, and that brings to mind some fairly potent connotations. I was hoping you could elaborate on that comparison and maybe broadly categorize what you believe our role or the nature of war in Afghanistan is, and perhaps going to the future, whether we should revert back to a Powell doctrine, which we don't seem to be doing with the Obama administration seemingly targeting for a 2013 pullout.
Well, it's a very complicated question, and the cop-out is to say you have to read all the details in Chapter 7 of my book. But, I frankly don't have confidence that I know or understand enough about Afghanistan to have a fully considered view. I went to Afghanistan once a couple months ago for a week, and that's the sum total of my familiarity with the country and its problems. It just seems to me that the obstacles to success are almost overdetermined. It seems to me in some ways the obstacles are greater than they were in Vietnam, at least in terms of the health of the internal political system, the relative hopelessness of apparently of corruption and double dealing, and the viability of the clients we're supporting. There are other differences. There's the more positive difference that there's no analogy really to North Vietnam and the North Vietnamese army, which really tilted the balance in Vietnam, although Pakistan seems as some ways comes close to fulfilling that part of the analogy. What makes me wring my hands is that it seems to me of all the involvements the United States has been in militarily in the post-Cold War period, the war in Afghanistan was the most legitimate use of force because it was an act of self-defense. The Taliban refused to extradite al-Qaeda after September 11th, so attacking Afghanistan was an act of self-defense. The problem is it's hard for me to see high odds that this government and all our best efforts are going to prevail. And I base that only on press accounts and reading the same things that most of you probably read. So I'm pessimistic. I think the closest thing to an analogy is that it appears that the client government we're supporting is more venal, less public-spirited, and less in tune with mobilizing popular support than the enemy. And if that's the case and it can't be changed, then I think there's not much we can do over the long term if we ever want to get out.
Some people, observers, would argue that America's geopolitical actions can be best understood through the prism of energy security and our need to protect the pipeline of oil to the United States and Iran's recent threats to close the Straits of Hormuz seem to underscore that vulnerability that we have to ensuring that that pipeline is protected. How in your book do you engage the issue of national energy security?
That is one of the few very important issues that I don't deal with in the book. It doesn't deal with everything. And I'm not an expert on energy, and I refer to it briefly in the concluding chapter, but I don't pretend to offer original or highly informed solutions to the problem. It seems to me that the problem of energy security is long-standing. It really goes back more or less symbolically to 1973, and we've been grappling with it off and on since then. And at least in my layman's view, what seems to me, not being an expert on the subject, Americans have essentially decided that this is one of the things we will say a lot about but not do much about, because if we had a serious concern for energy policy in security terms, we would have done some other painful things, like provide real incentives for conservation, gasoline taxes, things of that sort, that we've chosen not to do because they're inconvenient and because they would impinge on our lifestyle. And every once in a while something comes up that reminds us that this is a serious problem, such as the potential Iranian threats in the Strait of Hormuz. For the most part, it seems to me, except in a very dire scenario, we're talking about our interests rather than our basic security, interest in terms of the price of energy. Interference with supply from any one country could have a major impact on the market, could destabilize prices, could depress economic performance. But unless you saw a situation in which there was a widespread cutoff of supply, say, that was concerned in 1990, of course, that if the Iraqis took Saudi Arabia and controlled Saudi Arabia, much of the Gulf, and Iraq's oil, that they would really have their hand on our jugular then. Short of that, we're talking about a matter of basic economic interest rather than fundamental national security. If it were up to me, I'd have to study the problem a lot more carefully, but it seems to me we would do a number of things before we placed first priority on military solutions to the problem. Even if we wanted simply to try to guarantee our access to oil through military means rather than through other economic adjustments, I don't know that it can be done very practically, that there are many scenarios in which you could prevent the destruction or serious impairment of oil fields or other supply line functions if it was in a wartime situation, how you can prevent burning oil fields or destruction of port facilities, things of that sort. So I'm not sure that even the question of the relative desirability of military or other instruments aside, that the military instruments would be a reliable way of solving the problem.
I would like to ask you about the Arab revolt and the U.S.'s response to them. And more generally, I'm interested in the contradiction that seems to be there between our national interest versus this apparent intention of exporting democracy, which seems to be a rather chancy proposition in a place like Yemen, for instance. And more specifically, if you were the National Security Advisor, what would you advise the President about what we should do, if we should do anything about Syria today? Given that Syria is, the regime is being supplied with weapons by the Russians, I know that there's some talk about perhaps the U.S. and our allies, Turkey perhaps, supplying the rebels with weapons.
On the first question, it's another dilemma, and I'm most interested in dilemmas. I have that in the subtitle to my book because it seems to me those are the problems worth putting a lot of thought into because there's no easy answer. But the dilemma is that we cannot not support democratization. We can't oppose the Arab Spring, or at least what it looked like back in the spring, but that it poses great risks because even if the revolts succeed, we don't yet have much guarantee about how they'll wind up. If we had much confidence that they would wind up creating rough and ready liberal democracies, there'd be no problem. We'd be all for that, I think, even if it meant that we had cooler relations with Egypt or some other countries than we had under Mubarak. I think anything that approaches liberal democracy, we would find it comparatively easy to live with and morally desirable. The problem is if the results are either some sort of different kind of authoritarian government that's nastier than the ones that were overthrown, or illiberal democracy, majoritarian democracies that institute more repression of minorities. And so far, we don't see that those are going to be avoided. We don't know yet which way things are going to go in a lot of places. In Syria, it seems to me that unless you see a situation in which the opposition to the regime becomes militarily coherent and organized and looks like it can sustain itself, it doesn't make much sense to think about doing something like was done in Libya. And even then, it would be a different story. Syria is not Libya. It's a much bigger, in some ways more important, more difficult, and riskier place to get involved militarily. The easy and hard answer is the situation where certain covert actions might be advisable if they could be effective in supporting the opposition without getting directly and obviously involved. But covert actions are always risky for many reasons, and they may not even be practical for operational reasons. I don't know. But that seems to me an area where if they're done carefully, which is always something to be skeptical about, they pose fewer risks than sending in the Marines. So I don't have a solution to Syria other than to do what the administration's been doing and to look for openings to try to buttress the opposition if it can be done without entanglement.
Would you mind if I ask you a question about your last book on intelligence?
Go ahead.
In chapter 3, you talk about expertise as an enemy, and you go into explain how exceptional thinking is something that can be applied to come up with more creative answers to these kinds of dilemmas within national security. I'm wondering if, since you've written that book, if you've seen any success or improvement in the U.S. intelligence community in trying to apply that, and you say that, there's no way to put together a certain theory or methodology for how it would work, but if there's any intent or it would be worthwhile to put together some sort of best practices or guidance or training like that.
The short answer is no. I haven't seen anything where it looked like those recommendations were at work or where they would have been an obvious case that they're more appropriate than some other. I think maybe in regard to North Korea, that's a situation where there might be a special payoff from trying to get some fresh and less expert thinking involved, but I'm not entirely sure about that. If you're asking about improvement in the system as a whole, when I wrote the book, which was soon after the reform legislation in 2004, I was ambivalent about whether the reforms would be a good idea or not. And while I don't think we should try to reverse them because that'll just create more problems, I think probably on balance the creation of the Director of National Intelligence was a mistake. And that the system has, as far as I can see from the outside, which is a big limitation, has lost more in increased bureaucratic complexity than it has gained in better coordination. And I suspect the reason is that people didn't understand at the time that what they wanted from a new Director of National Intelligence could have been gotten from the old Director of Central Intelligence any time that the President wanted to give him that authority. And the President never did for many bureaucratic political reasons that persist and that have limited the authority of the DNI. So that's a long-winded way of saying I think it may be 6 of one, half dozen or another, but I don't think the reforms on balance have done a lot to help. But as far as adoption of my recommendation about exceptional thinking, it's hard to see a case where I'd say, aha, that's exactly what I had in mind.
I'm going to ask you about historical analogies and counterfactuals. So when you were talking about the Iran situation, you brought back to the Cold War situation of the Soviet Union going nuclear and China going nuclear, and so we didn't use preventive force there, and you think about the counterfactual, it certainly would have been worse had we used force there. And that's a fine counterfactual. I think most people would nod their heads. But there are other historical analogies, and so one can point to Iraq in 1981 and Israel's preventive use of force in the Osirak reactor, and say if Israel hadn't done that, what would have happened in 1990? So Israel's preventive use of force didn't stop Iraq's nuclear program; it just delayed it. And so as a result, in 1990, Iraq didn't have nuclear weapons. If Iraq had had nuclear weapons in 1990, gone into Kuwait, possibly gone to Saudi Arabia. It's hard to think how that would have been better. So my question is not really so much about the specifics, but about historical analogies, which is something that Frank Gavin's looked a lot at. How do you pick the right historical analogy? Why is your historical analogy better than my historical analogy?
I think the answer is you try to think of as many comparable cases as you can to get the biggest rough data set you can to see. And when I did that roughly as a thought experiment, I thought of one case where preventive war would have been a good idea with the benefit of hindsight, and that was 1936, the Rhineland crisis. If there'd been a fight then, maybe Hitler could have been overthrown, and while that wouldn't have solved the problems structurally in Europe that led to World War II, at least it would have bettered the odds that the full horror of 1939 to 45 wouldn't have happened as it did. So that's why I said in almost all cases preventive war is a bad idea. But I'm glad you brought up the Osirak case, because the second half of my chapter on preventive war is about that. And I have a view which is unconventional and is not shared by many people except some of the technical people I've talked with. And that is, it is a mistake to assume that the Israeli attack in 1981 delayed the Iraqi nuclear program. It destroyed a reactor, which cannot produce a bomb on its own. To produce a bomb from a reactor, you need a separate plutonium reprocessing facility, which Iraq didn't have. They had a hot cell, but not a substantial reprocessing facility. And to develop a credible nuclear weapon, it would have needed that facility, and that would have been a better signal about the countdown for preventive war. Of course, it's complicated. There were reasons they struck when they did because the contamination would have been greater later. But as it was, the reactor was not necessary to Iraq's nuclear weapons program. And what the Iraqis did with much higher priority, there's an article in International Security, I believe, at least I reviewed the original paper. I'm not sure what the revised version says, but looks into a lot of evidence from Iraq that the Israeli attack accelerated the Iraqi program, which didn't need a reactor, relied on uranium enrichment instead of plutonium. And by most reports, the Iraqis were not far from completing that program when the invasion of Kuwait happened. And if Saddam Hussein had had a little more patience and had waited, he might have had a nuclear weapon in his holster when he invaded, and history might have been different then. So no, we never know with counterfactuals. I would simply dispute that that particular one disproves my case or argues against it. Admittedly, most people don't share my diagnosis of the Osirak attack, but I think it holds up. Yes?
You mentioned China and Russia separately, but their partnership is on a lot of our minds, especially concerning the dual veto, which you mentioned Syria earlier. How will their relationship as it develops affect U.S. foreign policy?
Well, I don't think a Chinese-Russian alliance will be as, excuse me, would be as troublesome now as it was during the Cold War, the first half of the Cold War, but it would be unwelcome. And unfortunately, I think the United States and the West have been giving both countries reasons to overcome their many reasons for mutual suspicion or enmity, to subordinate them to their common interest in opposing the West. I think the expansion of NATO has poked a stick in the Russians' eye, has not only reversed the balance of power in a dramatic way, it has maintained implicitly the notion that there is still an antagonistic relationship between Russia and the West. If we had invited the Russians to join NATO too, that would have been a different story. But the expansion of NATO and the way policy has evolved has maintained more tension between Russia and the West than might have been necessary, at least in the early years of the post-Cold War period, at least in the early 90s, when it looked like Russia was on the way to democratization. Things look different now, but I think we missed a chance maybe to try a better relationship at that time. And similarly, there's more and more talk now about the rising tension between the United States and China. I think we do face the risk that we make prudent hedging against a potential Chinese threat, a self-fulfilling prophecy, if we do it too maladroitly and talk a lot about it. So, for example, the recent Obama revision of strategy, which was declared, and talked about rebalancing towards Asia. I think that makes perfect strategic sense, but I think it was a mistake to talk about it forthrightly and make it a big diplomatic statement. It's not good to have bad relations with either country. It's worse to have bad relations with both countries united in some sort of coordinated opposition. Even then, it won't be as dangerous a situation as during the Cold War, but it will be worse than necessary.
Please, your frank discussion, please. How much longer did the Iraq incursion by the allies of the United States last because of a mercenary army supported by the National Guard and reserve units and the corporations that benefited and profited so long from the invasion of Iraq?
That has a lot to do with the character of operations and how things were done. I don't think it had anything to do with the decision to invade Iraq. I think Bush did that for several reasons, including the declared one of eliminating weapons of mass destruction. But it did that for several reasons which were independent of the phenomena you mentioned. Now, a lot of people are unhappy about relying on a volunteer army for a number of reasons. I think there's no alternative to it. It's a matter of arithmetic. You can't have a conscript army and a small army at the same time without having conscription grossly unfair. And there are all sorts of reasons that it's out of the question. The use of reserves has mainly been a problem for the reserves. They're the ones who have suffered frequent call-ups, interruption of their civilian lives, the backdoor draft. And it's ironic because when the so-called total force was developed for the Army under Creighton Abrams way back in the 1970s, according to folklore at least, part of the rationale was that this would be a forcing mechanism to be sure that when the United States went to war, the public would have to face up to the decision and would have to support the decision because you couldn't go to war without calling up the reserves. I think it backfired because it underwrote the transition to a small professionalized force and a situation in which very few American families have any direct personal stake in the war. And this is the first war in our history, as far as I know, where not only did taxes not go up to support the war, but taxes were cut. And everybody venerates the military now. You have everybody saying when soldiers gives a lecture somewhere, thank you for your service. And when I went to the airport today, they let uniformed military personnel get on the plane first. I think, you know, in part that's because of a sort of latent tacit social guilt in part. But that didn't have anything to do, in my view, with the political decision of George Bush to go to war.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
Ties in a little bit to the Syria point. What do you see the role and efficacy of the UN as the U.S. brings its national security agenda going forward, particularly with that dynamic on the Security Council?
I think the United Nations is a useful organization, and occasionally it can have a significant impact at the margin, but I don't think it will play a major role in substituting for national decisions and actions that are not a matter of coordinated general multilateral action through the UN. Occasionally it matters whether there's a Security Council endorsement or not. For example, right now, when the Russians and the Chinese blocked action over Syria. But when the United States wants to do something it believes is important to do for its own reasons, it'll do so. That's what George Bush did on Iraq. He sent Colin Powell to the UN, hoped we might get the UN to sign on again because it worked out so well in 1990. That was the second UN-mandated war in history, even though there wasn't a UN command. We didn't get the UN endorsement in 2003, so we just did it anyway. So the UN can help in a number of ways, especially in non-military functions and for some peacekeeping operations where you want a multilateral flag to bless the legitimacy of it and to get other countries to send some troops and collect the per diem. The UN will be the appropriate mechanism, but I don't think it's going to play a fundamental determinative role in the major policy questions.
I often judge how important our work is by how often I go back to it and scribble and underline it. And every time I have something by Dick Betts, I look back and I've read it like 8 or 9 or 10 times, such that the pages have fallen apart. And I've read several of the chapters in this book, and every time I go back to anything that Dick writes, it just, the profit from returning to it is extraordinary. So I would highly recommend, for those of you who are interested in these questions, to go out and get this book. And I'd also like you all to please join me in thanking Dick for a terrific presentation.